Okay, and you welcome everybody to the third session for Scientists Warning Europe's Climate and Biodiversity Crisis Briefing for councils, councillors and council staff. As I apologise before to anybody who's been on all of our sessions, I will do a quick introduction to Scientists Warning for everybody. Scientists Warning Europe was set up to promote awareness of the 3 scientists' warnings to humanity. The first one was issued in 1992 and sponsored by the Union of Concerned Scientists. And it told us that we were on a collision course with the biosphere and called us to immediate action to try and put it right. That was signed by 1,700 scientists at the time, which was a vast number considering this was just pre-universal use of email. Then 25 years later on, the Alliance of World Scientists sponsored the issuing of another report, the World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a Second Notice, which when it was issued, told us that everything the first group of scientists had told us had gone wrong and was going wrong was absolutely correct, but it had gone wrong quicker than they'd suggested, and we now needed to react even faster to put it right. That was signed by 15,000 scientists when it was issued, and 20,000 scientists have now signed it. Then on the 5th of November in 2019, the world scientists issued their warning to humanity. So their climate emergency warning, and that was signed by 11,000 scientists when it was issued, and 15,000 have now signed it. So these are probably the most signed scientific reports of all time. Relevant to what we're just about to do today, the last climate emergency warning identified 6 key areas of action. And that was food, nature, population, short-lived pollutants, sustainable economy, and energy. And today we're going to be talking about both food and nature, focusing mostly on a food strategy for local councils, but also incorporating into that where it fits with land management and nature. I'm delighted to invite along our 3 speakers, and we're going to be starting by inviting Dr. Helen Harwatt to speak. Helen is a senior research fellow at Chatham House, focusing on food system shifts and their contribution to planetary health goals. Helen's current projects focus on assessing the impacts of food systems, shifts on a range of issues around environmental sustainability, public health and ethics, to identify pathways towards creating food systems that minimize adverse environmental impacts, maximize public health benefits, and address ethical issues. Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Ed, and hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for being here. I will be covering the big picture on the role of food in climate and biodiversity plans, and covering each of those topics separately and finishing with some common solutions. So the presentation does get much more positive towards the end, so definitely bear with it. And I will finish with an example from the research that I've been involved with. So starting with climate change. So I think it's just worth mentioning early on that this isn't just an environmental issue that we're dealing with. Climate change has actually been identified as the greatest threat to public health in the 21st century from the World Health Organization. So the context for climate change is that most emissions come from the G20. We currently have global temperature rise above 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and that's already having a range of negative impacts. The recent report from the IPCC on the 1.5 degrees found that the temperatures, the impacts at 1.5 degrees would actually be worse than they are at current temperatures, but not as bad as if we go to 2 degrees. So the impacts are definitely greater as well if temperature overshoots 1.5 degrees and then returns back down to 1.5 degrees at some point in this century. And that's because we could potentially put in motion a range of, basically destabilize a range of major ecosystems. So this graph shows some examples of that. So the yellow ones are basically within the Paris range, and they include major ice sheets and the coral reefs. And then if we look at the orange ones, which is basically the trajectory that we're currently on, if current emissions persist as they are. And this includes major forest ecosystems. And there are, of course, a range of interactions and feedbacks between those, which are demonstrated by the arrows. So we really want to avoid going above 1.5 degrees and then coming back down to 1.5 degrees at some point. And this requires us really adhering to the precautionary principle and the equity component of the Paris Agreement, which is essentially 1.5 degrees with no overshoot. And this requires us to reduce CO2 emissions by around 45% by 2030, so less than 10 years away, and getting those down to net zero by 2050. So what we need is for countries to increase their ambitions 5-fold in relation to the 1.5 degree goals and 3-fold for 2 degrees. And this requires global emissions to peak as soon as possible. And actually this should have been last year for the 1.5 degree goal. And this needs to be done in combination with strong and rapid reductions before 2030 and enhanced longer term commitments. And essentially, the longer we delay action, we put ourselves at greater risk of actually achieving climate goals, because we actually need then to rely on technology to remove emissions from the atmosphere at some point in the future, which we're not even sure is possible, hence the risk. So do we need to include food in these climate goals? So currently food systems account for around 33% of global emissions. And a recent analysis published at the end of last year found that even if we were to completely stop fossil fuel emissions immediately, the current trends in the global food system would actually prevent us meeting the 1.5 degree goal. And if we look at this in a little bit more detail, analysis that I published found that the livestock sector alone could use around half of the budget related to the 1.5 degrees goal and around 37% of the budget related to the 2 degrees goal by 2030. So we can offset some of those emissions with technology improvements, but this is nowhere near enough. And actually reducing the production and consumption of animal products is unavoidable. And if we were to avoid reducing food emissions, this would essentially require other sectors to increase their mitigation efforts far beyond what is planned or realistic. And if we just look at that emissions budget associated with 1.5 degrees goal, which is the equivalent of less than 10 years now of current emissions, we can see there that there is really no room for any wiggle room for any sector to sort of avoid reducing emissions. And this becomes even more apparent when we factor in the need to reduce massive amounts of emissions from the atmosphere, in addition to these strong and rapid reductions of emissions on the ground. So just to go into the carbon dioxide removal a little bit more. So this is absolutely essential for the 1.5 degrees target and is likely needed for 2 degrees. All of the options currently being looked at require large areas of land. So these are, for example, the carbon capture and storage, where we have essentially biofuels being grown, such as miscanthus, transferred to power stations and burnt for energy. And their emissions are captured before they're actually released into the atmosphere. The CO2 is removed and that is buried in geological formations. This technology is currently it's quite heavily relied on in many climate change plans. We also have microbes and biochar that could sequester and hold carbon in the soil. And there are definitely numerous challenges with the high-tech options, particularly around bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And actually, the only option that we currently have at the scale needed is to restore vegetation, such as through reforestation. And of course, doing this also requires large amounts of land, which raises legitimate questions around food security and land competition. But we really do need to look at agricultural land in this, because it's actually the biggest user of land globally. And if we disaggregate that, we found that animal agriculture uses 83% of the agricultural land in return for relatively little contribution to the food system in terms of nutrition. So around 18% of calories, 37% of protein, and that's in contrast to crops, which use 17% of agricultural land and provide definitely the bulk of calories and protein for global consumption. So just to wrap up this section, we need radical climate action far beyond that is currently planned, and that's required across all sectors including food. So moving on to biodiversity loss, and for this section, I'll mostly draw from a report that we published last month. And the background context is that biodiversity loss is accelerating. The last round of global biodiversity targets were not met. Those are due to be revised at some point this year. That's not certain. And we have around 25% of species at risk of extinction and an additional 1 million more facing extinction within decades. So the crucial thing to point out here is that biodiversity collectively contributes to and supports key planetary processes. So for example, terrestrial and marine ecosystems remove more than half, around 60% of all carbon emissions from the atmosphere, and therefore play a crucial role in regulating the Earth's temperature. And right now, these are the only ways that we actually have of removing emissions from the atmosphere on that scale. Food systems are a leading driver of biodiversity loss, and a recent analysis found that under business as usual meat production and consumption accelerates habitat loss the most, threatening over 17,000 species. And going forward, more than 1,000 species are projected to lose at least 25% of their habitats by 2050 if no changes are made to the food system, making it much more likely, essentially, for those species to go extinct. So there are a range of ways that food systems impact on biodiversity loss. So obviously there is chemical pollution from pesticides, fertilizers and manures applied to land and finding their way into waterways and causing eutrophication in rivers and oceans, leading to dead zones. We also have habitat loss through land clearance, such as deforestation, removing habitats directly, but also bringing different species into contact with each other, causing more competition for food and other resources. We also have a dominance of monocultures as well, which provide little opportunity for diverse wildlife, as food and habitat types are limited in monocultures. And related to this is the lack of diversity in food production. So we're really growing a small amount of foods compared to the many more that we could be growing. So for example, in the UK, crop production is dominated by 7 crops, which take 91% of cropland. So these are wheat, grass, forage, barley, rapeseed, sugar beet, potatoes, and oats. We also have the direct killing of wildlife. So for example, farmers removing potential predators such as wolves if they're seen to be interfering with farmed animals, or animals that might be seen to spread disease such as badgers in the UK. And of course, as we've already seen, food systems make a very large contribution to climate change, which has a range of impacts on wildlife. For example, making habitats unviable, forcing wildlife to move to new areas, essentially finding new homes, and in that possibly competing with other wildlife and facing wildfires or food and water shortages, for example. And in all of this, agriculture has the biggest burden in return for very little contribution to the food system in terms of nutrition. So the common solutions, this is the good news part. So here there are some common solutions in the food system to help address climate and biodiversity issues. So those are shifting to plant-based diets. So this essentially reduces impacts across the board. Second, and in addition to that, we need to massively reduce food waste. We need to preserve existing habitats, which requires us not to expand agricultural land any further into those habitats. And in addition to that, we need to restore lost habitats. So it's not good enough to just preserve existing habitats. We also need to be restoring some of those habitats that have already been converted to farmland. And we also need to produce food differently, essentially farming in a way that is less detrimental, using fewer chemicals and providing more space for wildlife. So those issues will be covered in a bit more in the following talk. But essentially what we this is the really crucial point in this. What we really determines what we can do with farming and land use and farming practices. So this is really the essential part of this picture. And just to demonstrate what this might actually deliver, so this analysis we published towards the end of last year, and while it doesn't cover every point in the previous slide, it's certainly a good example of how we can help meet climate and biodiversity goals at the same time. So we looked at how much CO2 is essentially prevented being sequestered under current land use from animal agriculture. And we also looked at a range of different dietary scenarios as well to see what the potential is for sequestering CO2 under those situations. So this first figure shows the additional carbon that could be sequestered if pasture and feed croplands were returned to their native vegetation cover, which we disaggregated into forest and grassland. So the depth of the green colour varies according to the amount of carbon that could be sequestered. So the darkest colours you can see represent the biggest concentrations. And just to point out that this is carbon sequestered in addition to that being sequestered already by pasture, for example. And it might be surprising for some of you to see that even areas that are already considered to be very green, such as Ireland, could actually be much greener. So the total amount of sequestration, or the carbon opportunity cost, as we're calling it, for animal agriculture is around 153 gigatons of carbon. And this is mainly under pasture land, so that accounts for around 72% of that carbon opportunity cost. And just to point out in this that we did include other greenhouse gas emissions that would be saved in this kind of scenario. So there's a methane and nitrous oxide, and these have been quantified elsewhere and will be covered more in the next presentation. So in addition to looking at the sequestration amounts spatially, we also looked at it by country income groups. And what we found is that around 70% of the sequestration potential globally occurs in high and upper middle income countries. So this is roughly split between cropland and pasture in high income countries, and around 70% from rewilding pasture land in upper middle income countries. So this is a really important point, considering at the beginning of the talk, we saw that the bulk of emissions come from G20 countries. So there's definitely a big role there for high income nations to play in this. We also looked at diet shifts and the amount of carbon that could be sequestered under these different dietary scenarios in relation to business as usual. So that's essentially if land was returned to its native vegetation cover, which could be forest or grassland in our scenarios. And we found that under a business as usual situation up to 2050, we would actually be losing more carbon to the atmosphere due to further land clearance to convert more land to agriculture. And this was using an optimistic yield improvement as well up to 2050, but that was still insufficient to meet the expected increased demands for animal feed. So under the Eat Lancet diet, we could sequester around 9 years worth of current fossil fuel emissions, and the vegan diet gave us the biggest benefit, sequestering around 16 years of current fossil fuel emissions. And just in case anyone's not familiar with it, the Eat Lancet diet is around a 70% meat reduction compared to current business as usual diets, and those will be covered more in the next presentation. So we also repeated this scenario for the UK. We disaggregated global analyses down to the UK, and we published this as a separate report. And what we found is that most of the cropland in the UK is used for animal feed, and almost half of all land in the UK is used for animal agriculture. So if we actually restored native vegetation cover on that land, which in the UK is mostly temperate forest, this would remove around 4.5 billion tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere. And again, the darkest colour that you can see there represents the most dense sequestration. And the majority of this sequestration occurs through rewilding pasture land. So this mostly occurs along the west here, accounting for around 73% of that sequestration total. So how does this relate to UK climate goals? In that first scenario, that's equivalent to around 12 years worth of current UK CO2 emissions and would essentially double the 1.5 degrees budget up to 2050. If we just reforest the pasture land in the UK, that's equivalent to around 9 years worth of current UK CO2 emissions and would extend the 1.5 degrees budget by around 75%. And both of these scenarios would actually make UK agriculture net negative, either of those scenarios. And there are a raft of co-benefits associated with this kind of shift, which will be mentioned in the following presentations. So I won't go into those yet, but they're around a big range of environmental co-benefits and public health co-benefits as well. And just to touch on that, I think the transformative aspects of this shift is definitely well worth bearing in mind in this. So if we think about the kind of landscape level changes, that would be very noticeable and would allow for much more recreation, for example. And we can see from the literature that this has really important wellbeing benefits. So just to wrap up, I mean, all I'd really like to say at this point is that these issues need addressing urgently. Action over the coming decade is absolutely crucial, and it can't just be focused on energy, it has to be food and energy. So those reports that I was involved in, if anybody's interested, are all publicly available and free to download at the following links. And yeah, just to say thanks very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Just wondering, actually, Helen, if you might be able to pop those links straight into the chat, actually, as we're proceeding, and people can just bring them up on their screen straight away. That would be lovely.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, that's great. Right. Marco, if you could just unmute, just so that I can see you.
Hi there.
Right, excellent, great, nice, welcome, Marco, thanks, I saw you come in. So, great, I'd like to then introduce Dr. Marco Springman, Senior Researcher in the Centre on Population Approaches for Non-Communicable Disease Prevention in the Nuffield Department of Population Health. That's a sentence. Since 2017, he's working on a Wellcome-funded project, Livestock, Environment and People. Marco holds a PhD in economics from the University of Oldenburg in Germany, an MSc in sustainability from the University of Leeds in the UK, and an MS in physics from Stony Brook University. He's a junior research fellow at Linacre College, University of Oxford, and an honorary research associate in the Food Systems Group of the Environmental Change Institute. Marco, I will leave it to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. You should see my presentation now. Is that okay? Yes?
It's fine.
Great. So I'll talk a little bit more also about the health co-benefits of dietary changes. As you already heard, and we also showed in some previous papers, globally dietary changes towards more plant-based diets are really needed to stay within key planetary boundaries of the food system, including the greenhouse gas boundary related to climate change, the land use boundary, biogeochemical flow boundaries related to fertilizer application of nitrogen and phosphorus, and the blue or freshwater planetary boundary. Of course, in combination with other measures. Okay. What you see here is that those other measures like technological changes at the farm level can be very potent when it comes to cropland use, water use, and fertilizer application. But those dietary changes are really needed specifically for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. The level of change we are talking about is really quite extraordinary. So at the global level, we would need quite almost a 90% reduction in red meat, and even higher in high-income countries like the UK, and over 60% reductions in white meat, sugar, dairy, and quite a big increase in the consumption of legumes, nuts and seeds, vegetables, and so on. At the same time, such dietary changes can have a lot of health implications globally, and in most regions, dietary risks are one of the biggest risk factors for premature mortality. In the UK, it's number 2 after tobacco. And those risk factors really include low consumption of low grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, and high consumption of processed meat, red meat, sodium, sugar, and so on. I was fortunate to be part of the Eat Lancet Commission that Helen already mentioned, and there we try to define a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. And here, and what we looked at for the health part there were meta-analysis of observational cohort studies that indicate what people get sick of and die from, basically controlling for all other changes in their behavior. And what you can see here is that it very clearly indicates, and I should say a value over 1 means increase in risk, a value less than 1 is reduction in risk. And here you see some of the examples that we looked at in the commission. And you see clearly that increased consumption of processed meat is associated with an increased risk of dying from coronary heart disease, stroke, colorectal cancer, type 2 diabetes. And findings like this prompted the Cancer Agency of the World Health Organization to declare processed meat carcinogenic to human, and unprocessed red meat, which you can see right below, still with an increased risk, as likely carcinogenic to humans. For dairy, the evidence is much less clear, so it might reduce mildly the risk of type 2 diabetes, but that's probably more because of the calcium levels. And it might mildly increase the risk of prostate cancer, but overall, it's mostly neutral in terms of disease profile. When it comes to seafood, it's also more neutral than people usually think. It might, when consumed in moderation, mildly decrease risk of coronary heart disease. But when you adjust for the fact that fish eaters eat less red meat and more fruits and vegetables, then that is not significant anymore. More consistent is the evidence for plant-based foods. There you see across the board that increased consumption of nuts, legumes, fruits and vegetables, and whole grains is associated with reduced risk for coronary heart disease and other diet-related diseases. This you can put together with evidence of how body weight changes those very same disease endpoints, and which leads to lookup tables like at the right, what tells you a balanced energy intake is by sex and age, and you end up with fairly broad dietary recommendations. So within the Eat Lancet Commission, we recommended that people not have more than 1 serving of red meat per week, not more than 2 servings of fish or poultry per week each, and not more than 1 serving of milk or milk product per day, which leaves one day a week vegetarian and another day vegan. Of course, you can be more strict as you want to. So those recommendations are in line with having a pescatarian diet that emphasizes more fish consumption, but also with a vegetarian or vegan diet that goes more plant-based. In order to make sure we know what we recommend makes sense, we ran that analysis through a detailed nutritional analysis, a mortality analysis, an environmental analysis, and the food system analysis that I already showed you at the beginning of the talk. So in the following, I'd like to show you a few of the results and compare it to the national dietary guidelines we have in this country, which is the Eat Well Guide. So the thing with the Eat Well Guide is when we look back, it has a pretty picture, but other than that, it really doesn't say very much. So if you try to eyeball what it says, you can only find that it tells you you should have your 5 portions of fruits and vegetables. You should eat more beans and pulses. Not sure what more means here really. You should have 2 portions of fish and eat less red and processed meat, but it's also not really quantified how much less. So the fact that there is so little quantification here makes it a little bit hard for I think, the average person to understand, but also to analyze it properly. So if we quantify it in some way, taking on board those things that are actually written out, then we find that if people were adhering to that advice, it really wouldn't reduce the potential shortfalls in nutrient intake very much. And here you see the comparison between current diets in the UK, the National Dietary Guidelines, and the 4 different Eat Lancet dietary patterns. And you see that the latter ones address nutrient intake and nutrient adequacy quite a bit better. In the mortality analysis, we found that the National Dietary Guidelines here could be associated with a reduction in mortality of 80,000, but that would be increased to over 100,000 less diet-related deaths in the 4 Eat Lancet dietary patterns. And you see here, the more plant-based, the higher the reduction in diet-related deaths in the country. In the environmental analysis, we found that, well, the National Dietary Recommendations could be associated with mild reductions in environmental resource use, but that was really no comparison to what the 4 Eat Lancet dietary patterns could achieve, where you see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by more than 80% here for a completely plant-based one. You see also a slight increase in water use here. We don't think that's a problem, since that can be addressed with technological changes quite a bit, but that should also be mentioned. And then lastly, it doesn't really matter much if you have a national reduction in resource use when we talk about global environmental and health targets like the Paris Climate Agreement or the planetary boundaries related to climate change and other environmental domains. And here you see what we call a global sustainability test, where we modeled what would happen if everybody were to follow basically the UK diet or the UK National Dietary Guidelines in addition to those other diets. And what you see here is that because there is really a lack of very stringent recommendations on reducing animal source foods, the National Dietary Guidelines in the UK really wouldn't do much to reduce the overshoot specifically in greenhouse gas emissions of our current diets. And the percentage here really shows you how much of a percent show you percent of planetary boundary impact. So 100%, less than 100% is to stay within those, more than 100% is overshooting. And you see here, the 2 ones are overshooting quite a bit, and really only the 4 more balanced dietary patterns, the flexitarian, pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan patterns, stay within those. And the reason, as I mentioned, is as you can see here, as an example for the greenhouse gas emissions, the very high emissions from animal source foods that are not reduced or addressed by national dietary guidelines. So the upshot of that part is really dietary changes towards more plant-based diets can improve nutrient intake, reduce diet-related mortality, reduce environmental resource demand, and indeed are necessary to stay within the environmental limits of the food system. The big question is now, how do we achieve such dietary changes in practice? And the behavioral science literature seems to indicate here that there is no magic bullet, and instead we really need integrated multi-component approaches that include any of the following: information campaigns, which alone are very likely not enough, fiscal measures such as food taxation or subsidies, school workplace programs, or changes in the local food environment that is very relevant for the talk today, I suppose, as well as diet restrictions and mandates when it comes to, for example, having foods that are declared carcinogenic in public canteens or in procurement. on each of those, we did some analysis. So in addition to analyzing the UK dietary guidelines, we also looked at all other dietary guidelines around the world, and we found that 98% didn't fulfill all the 6 targets and environmental and health targets we looked at. And most were really in need for change. The only ones that did well were ones that because of their population, they have very low consumption of animal source foods and therefore didn't recommend a very high increase. We also looked at how food prices need to be adjusted if they were to include a measure of climate damage or a price of CO2. And here we found that beef should be at least 40% more expensive on average. We did the same for health motivated food taxation and found that if you were to integrate the health costs of treating diet-related diseases associated with red and processed meat consumption, then red meat should be roughly 20% more expensive in high-income countries, and processed meat, such as sausages, for example, should be double its price to pay for the health costs that would, at a population level, occur and would be associated with one serving of red and processed meat. We also looked at putting that together. You can talk about something like the full cost of food. And we found that even just those 2 limited aspects, the climate damages and the healthcare costs, would be so large that they would essentially double the cost of diets in high income countries and make all more healthy and sustainable dietary patterns cheaper. So there is a financial benefit of basically integrating implementing this full cost approach. What you see here also is, though, that especially in high and middle income countries, those healthy and sustainable diets are already more cost effective than current diets. And the reason here is that animal source foods cost a lot of money. So if you substitute away from those, you actually feel it in your pocket. So even without those, that full costing, which we think is necessary, even without that, you see that there is some money to be saved in the pockets of citizens. Lastly, what I want to mention is that it makes no sense to only talk about consumption. We also need to talk about food production, which need to be adjusted to be sustainable. And here you see a projection to 2050, how production needs to change to be in line with, in this case, the flexitarian Eat Lancet recommendations. And you see that in the UK, we really don't need more stable crops or sugar or animal source foods, but instead need to transition to producing more fruits, vegetables, legumes, and so on. That can happen if you combine agricultural incentives with environmental or health incentives, and is really something that really need to be explored more. And that can be at a local level, probably also be explored with things like community gardens and providing incentives on that. So with that, I want to leave you. I hope that you saw that healthy and sustainable food systems and diets, I think, are achievable, but they really require a synergistic combination of improvements in all kinds of things, and very importantly, dietary changes towards healthier and more plant-based diets. That requires strong regulations and the right incentives, and really attention to also local context to see what can be implemented. The most important thing here is really that inaction is not an option. So we projected that the environmental resource demand would increase by 50 to 90% without any targeted mitigation options, and by that point, the environmental resource use would exceed key planetary boundaries and really risk destabilizing ecosystems. So I hope that gives some impetus for thinking about some concentrated action. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Marco. That's absolutely great. An enormous number of statistics. I think people are going to want to be looking at your slides later on to get their heads around some of those, I should think. Right, excellent. I'd now like to introduce Professor Andrew Baumford. So Andrew is Professor of Conservation Science in the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge, where his research focuses on how to reconcile biodiversity conservation with meeting human food needs and other land-demanding activities, the costs and benefits of retaining intact ecosystems, and identifying what works in conservation. Andrew collaborates closely with conservation practitioners and with colleagues in other disciplines, including economics and psychology. He's published a book, Wild Hope, in which he argues that cautious, evidence-based optimism is vital in tackling environmental challenges. And he helped establish the Student Conference on Conservation Science, the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and Earth Optimism. So that's quite a good start. Looking forward to some optimism in this, Andrew, with a lot of realism, I'm sure. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping you can see my slides. Yeah, can you see them?
Yes, it's fine.
Great, thank you very much. Very nice to see everybody. I'm going to be very brief, actually. I'm just going to have a few slides. I'm going to summarize where I've come to on this issue from the perspective of a biodiversity conservationist. I'm an ecologist, really, but have spent the last 15 years, as Ed summarized, trying to work out how we can reconcile human needs over the next half century or so with safeguarding the climate and trying to limit the extent of the ongoing extinction crisis. And really, I'm going to summarize what's been said and try to turn it into perhaps some practical, suggest some practical steps that people like yourselves might be interested in taking. I think what we've heard and what the literature show is that there are, broadly speaking, 3 sets of ways in which we can shrink the footprint of the food system, whether nationally or globally. And we need to do that because there is no other human activity that has as great an impact on the climate or on the fate of the 10 million other species that we share the planet with as our production and consumption of food. It's inescapable that food has to be the center of the answers to these enormous challenges. Those 3 broad things, as we've already heard, repeated with lots of data. I don't think you need more data from me on this. One is a shift towards plant-based diets. A second, which I haven't heard so much of, but it was on a few slides, is to try to reduce food waste in this country. Somewhere between 30 and 40% of all food that's grown is wasted before it gets to someone's mouth. And so there's a lot to be done there. And critically, which is a point that Helen addressed in passing on in her presentation, we need to increase farm yields, by which I mean production per unit area. And we need to do that for 2 reasons. One is that higher yielding systems tend to be more efficient in terms of things like greenhouse gas emissions, so that per ton of product, high yielding systems actually have lower emissions. So you have lower emissions from the production side of things, but critically, increasing farm yields means that any given amount of food can be produced in a smaller total area, which means you can free up some of your land for other purposes, including critically the sorts of land intensive approaches to drawing down carbon that Helen talked about. We have to make space for those things to happen. We have to make space for other species. And the only way to do that, given that the vast majority of our land in this country is dominated by food production, is by making our food production more efficient in terms of the area that it occupies. And that's going to involve embracing new technologies, new and emerging technologies in farming, and being brave about that, in my view, and making existing practices more efficient. I'm going to make just a few points about just to sort of follow up on these three points. One is that we're going to need all three of these actions. One of them by itself won't work. Two of them by themselves won't work. We need them to we need to pursue all three of these routes. And you can get an idea of that in this diagram. I apologize, this is a little bit complicated, but what we've got here, hopefully you can see my arrow, is it's a heat map, we call it, but the colors on this chart show where we will be in 2050 in terms of emissions from of greenhouse gases from UK land as a result of food production systems under different combinations of food systems. And so the redder the color, the greater the emissions, the lighter the color, the lower the emissions. And the contour lines simply just show areas of option space, if you like, that have an equal overall greenhouse gas footprint. So if you look at it in that sense, then if you look at, I'm just trying to get my mouse to show up, whoops, my mouse to show up on this. Whoa, come back. If you look at it in that sense, we can get quite a long way. If we look up this axis here, we're going to be reducing, as we move up here, we're reducing meat consumption. We're shifting towards more plant-based diets, and the colors are getting paler as we move up here. So we can get quite a long way as we reduce meat consumption, exactly as Marco was telling us. But if we really want to get over into this yellow space and actually to be to achieve net zero in food production, which we need to do by 2050, we need to be around here in this yellow zone, this orange contour here. Then we also need to increase yields on the land where we produce our food, and that will both, as I say, increase the efficiency with which food is produced, the emissions per unit of production, and free up space for those area demanding ways that we need to pursue to draw down emissions. So we need combinations of these three approaches. One by themselves, what one by itself won't simply won't do. What does this mean in terms of things that organisations like councils can do? Well, just to highlight some, put a few things on here that we might want to talk about later. In terms of a shift towards plant-based diets, councils obviously are an important position in terms of the procurement of food for their own outlets. I think that's particularly important in the context of nurseries and schools, where not only is quite a lot of food being served, but critically social norms are being set for the next generation. So a shift towards plant-based diets in nurseries and schools can have disproportionate benefit. And then also in terms of training, things like catering colleges. At the moment, most chefs are trained that food, a good meal has to have meat in it. In terms of reductions in food waste, there is scope obviously in outlets for thinking about better food management systems, for things like portion control, which can be developed through interesting ideas around plate sizes and so forth. Most of the food wasted in those situations is after it's been served to people. One other aside here, which is interesting, which I've had a PhD student work on, is that up until 2001 in this country, a large portion of our food waste used to go to feed pigs. Then we had the foot and mouth epidemic, which of course led to a ban on the use of pig swill. Pig swill hasn't stopped being used globally. It has across the European Union as part of that, but it hasn't globally. And interestingly, in Japan and Korea, it's actually mandated that you're obligated to feed food waste still to pigs. Instead, in the European Union, we went down the route of banning it, and as a result, an area of around around 2 million hectares. It's always about the size of Wales, but in this case, about the size of Wales. Largely in Brazil, was cleared of natural vegetation to make way for producing food to feed pigs in Europe. We could return to the use of pig swill over the next 10 or 20 years, and as a result, free up space for these badly needed other sorts of interventions. And then last, the increase in farm yields. What can councils do? Well, I think one is again through procurement policies, and the second is perhaps through general awareness raising. I don't think we're going to be able to make space for other species, or indeed for carbon sequestration through restoration and re-wetting of wetlands and so forth, through pursuing low yield farm approaches, I think we're going to have to be pursuing high yields, and that means having difficult discussions around things like organic food production. The last point I want to reiterate here is then how do these things combine to make to address greenhouse gas emissions from the food system? Well, I just want to underscore there are two routes here. One is that all of these three things together reduce the direct emissions associated with the food system. But critically, they also have the potential then to make space by shrinking the area of land that's needed to meet our food demand. They have the potential to make space for large-scale restoration of carbon sequestering natural habitats, in particular in this country, woodlands and wetlands, which together, along with the direct emissions reductions, can get us towards net zero. But alongside that, would simultaneously have the capacity to deliver major co-benefits, other things that people really care about, in particular, better flood retention, and therefore reductions in flood risk in downstream catchments, better water quality, better options, much greater options for outdoor recreation, which is key both to physical and mental well-being, of course, and critically, a greater prospect for the nation's biodiversity. I think that's all I want to say, Ed. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully we can pick some of those points up again in questions.
Great, thank you very, very much, Andrew. Just before I continue, Marco, how long do you have with us before you need to go? Or have you gone? Right, okay, well, I can't see Marco myself, so there's just a lot of people to look through, so. Right, okay, let's assume that Marco had to go. I know he had to go earlier, so that's fine. Okay, in which case then we'll continue. And I think it's probably worth just telling everybody at this moment that on the day after Mother Earth Day, which I think off the top of my head is the 23rd of April, Helen is intending with Scientists Warning Europe that we will run a food strategy day based around what local councils can be doing. So in fact, some of the things that people have been talking about, the idea currently, and Helen can correct this if she wants to in a minute when she's talking, is that we would be allowing people to come to a sort of an ongoing day session in which we would go through some of these issues and then take in detail questions, have breakouts with people to lead the discussions, and see if we can help guide some of the councils to the food strategy part of their climate change action plans. So any input on that will be welcome both today but also in the future. Please feel free to send emails through to us at Scientists Warning Europe, and we will let everybody know on email when we have that organised. Okay, there's been quite a lot of questions coming through, but there's clearly one or a couple of overlapping questions, which I will put, and I'll probably start with Helen on this if Marco has gone, and then if Andrew would like to come on after that. We hear it all the time, actually, when we do discuss this, Helen. We had it before as well when you've done a talk before, and that's we've got to convince. We've got three different sections of people to convince. So it comes down to the psychology and the arguments to get them there. We've got our farmers, so we've got to convince our farmers to get across the line and embrace this change in use of their land, both in terms of increasing the biodiversity and the rewilding, and also in terms of change of the agricultural practices. Maybe we'll focus on that to begin with, on farmers. And somebody mentioned in one of the questions, brought it to actually talking about the NFU, the National Farmers Union, which needs to be convinced as a powerful body to do the right thing in this relation. But I would just bring in a quote from Stuart Roberts, who's the vice president there, when I questioned him at one talk where he was giving. And Stuart Roberts actually was quite clear that if the farmers and the Farmers Union got told that there was a net zero target for farming of 2030, they'd just get on and do it. But if the government doesn't impose a target on them like that, they're not going to do it, and they'll stick to going for the targets they've set themselves. Anyway, a joint question, both a bit about the overall farming community and do we need legislation to do it, and also how do we convince farmers at the local level? So Helen.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, two really good questions and quite big ones as well, I think. Just to touch on the targets aspect, I think, of course, we really need targets, and we do have them for 2050 in the UK, and the sort of interim targets in the committee, in the climate change plans. I think the big problem is that we just don't really think about food in those. Yeah, we just really focus on energy. So that really needs to change. And hopefully with the sort of things that we've demonstrated today, that would go somewhere towards that evidence base for really showing just how crucial it is to build food into those action plans in quite a central way, especially when we think about the need for carbon sequestration, for example, and where we're actually going to get that land from in order to restore native habitats to remove emissions from the atmosphere. We definitely have to include food in that, there's no doubt about it. And going back to the farming issue, yeah, I think this is a really interesting one, and it's something that I'm in the very early stages of getting a project on. And I think one of the curious things for me is just to really find out how farmers perceive all of this. Like, are they actually really keen to continue business as usual? Do they see the opportunities with the growing market for plant-based products? What kind of support do they need to be able to transition their farming practices to align with these future food systems that we know we need to create? And what role is there for government and maybe corporations to actually assist those transitions? So not really any answers, unfortunately. I just think it is a really crucial topic, definitely, to think about farmers and how to enable those transitions to occur.
Great, thank you. Andrew, as it goes over to you, can I just add in one thing on one of the questions, so a slight flavouring to the original one, and that's that somebody had brought up the idea or the issue that a lot of councils have a lot of tenant farmers. So actually councils have quite a big opportunity for acquiring the change of land use through tenant farmers if they should choose to take it up. So it's the same question, but maybe extend it to whether they should use those powers.
So yes, it's a short answer to that one. Of course, we all need to be engaged in encouraging these changes at all levels, and if councils have power to do that, tremendous. In a different context, my university has some tenant farmers, and I'm trying to put pressure on them to do the same thing. So yes, we should. So just to, it's critically important, obviously, how this aligns with the farming community and how we bring farmers into this. I think, well, just a few observations. The NFU is not all farmers. Many farmers I speak to don't think the NFU speaks for them or their values or what they're trying to achieve, and I think that's worth remembering in this. A second is obviously that sometimes, depending on the situation, these will be huge changes for farmers, and we shouldn't underestimate those. But that in some circumstances, I mean, in particular, I'm thinking about upland farming in parts of the UK, which is currently very, certain parts is very largely dependent on subsidies for its economic viability at the moment. In some cases where I've seen what might be called rewilding, I don't particularly like that word, but rewilding going on in some of those parts of the world, it's associated with more jobs and more security of jobs than current farm practices, as well as creating landscapes that people then come to enjoy, to recreate in, and so on, more than currently, as well as storing carbon and slowing water flows downstream and so forth. So there are benefits, and farmers can in quite a few instances see that. And I think the last thing is just to say that we're obviously in a state of tremendous flux in terms of the structure of agricultural subsidies in this country. The next 5 years, they will change a great deal, I think. And we will see those incentives, I think, I'm fairly confident we'll see them directed more away from subsidising on the basis of what we might call conventional farming, and increasingly those subsidies being used to incentivise land use practices which deliver things that markets currently don't, like carbon storage and floodwater retention. And so I think with as the money moves in that direction, as you say, farmers are business people, and a large portion of them will move in that direction too. I think there are still very important cultural sensitivities that we need to bear in mind, social issues and so forth. But we have to do it. I don't see an option. The last point to note is just I have a student at the moment who's been working with farmers doing what are called choice experiments, but designed to try and tease out what their preferences are. And what we find in doing a large-scale survey of that in the arable part of the world where I come from is that farmers aren't disinclined to do some of these things. In fact, when you look at what they would ask in these choice experiments, what they would require by way of payment to do these different things, actually some of these approaches which would involve large-scale production of blocks of natural habitat may be a much more cost-effective way of doing things like retaining carbon on the landscape than things that we've been doing up until now around, for instance, hedgerow management. Farmers may be more willing, and it may be much more cost effective to persuade them to do so by planting up large blocks of woodland. That's all I say.
Great, thank you. Now, there's a lot of different questions coming in from a lot of different angles, but just sticking for 1 second on one of the other constituents for councils, consumers. So we're not going to get this shift unless we shift consumers to a less meat-based diet and also shift them to reducing their own food waste. Have either of you got ideas on practices or policies or motivational programs that councils could bring in to encourage their consumers to change their diets, which of course would then ultimately change what farmers grow? As you say, they're businessmen. And then the second thing is in order to reduce their food waste. You did mention it in very brief terms, but I'd be interested to know if you know of any practices or any examples.
Yeah, I could go first, Ed. I actually have some really nice examples from Oslo. So Oslo, as part of the Global Lead City Network, are doing quite a number of things with other major cities, including London. So one of the things they're doing is a default veg at their municipal events. So this is essentially, if you have a conference, the menu is just vegan unless somebody actually chooses a different option instead. So currently it's the other way around. So we're just basically flipping that. They also have a goal to halve meat consumption at the municipality of Oslo canteens and institutes by the end of 2023. So that's actually really soon and quite an impressive target. I think that's a really kind of standout target. And what in combination with that, they have a sort of mandate to always offer a satisfactory vegan alternative. And they're also working on advertising for meat and unhealthy foods around the city areas to reduce that. And they are introducing a free meatless meal in schools for every student in Oslo schools and providing free fruit and veg to students in secondary schools, and also defining requirements for sustainable procurement in institutes around the city as well. So a whole range of things going on there. Just one example in Oslo. I think they're quite ambitious and really good to think about. Andrew, do you have any others?
Yeah, yes, this is this is a really important and difficult set of things, but I think the last 5 years things have moved and they're moving fast, faster still. I think we're learning quite a lot, and I'm learning quite a lot. I'm working on this with colleagues in psychology, for example, and what they tell me, these are people that work for a long time on things like on related issues around tobacco and alcohol and so forth. Education won't do it. Education will help, but that legitimizes other things, but it won't change people very much. Most people very much. Taxes do help, they do work. Changing prices works. That's not necessarily within the gift of councils, and it's deeply unpopular politically, but I think we're going to see a move, and certainly stronger and stronger calls towards taxing high carbon, high footprint food, particularly meats, but probably other things. I think we'll see calls for that in the next few years. Choice, what I think those in the business call choice editing is also important, actually removing options from menus entirely. So this is if it's a restaurant type outlet. So my university took a bold decision on this 2 years ago. So within the outlets of the University of Cambridge, not the colleges, but the overall university bits, we haven't been able to have ruminant meat served for 2 years now. The very clever thing about it, which is very interesting, we just developed this with the catering department, who are a business, they have to make money, and they're also very sensitive to what their customers want, was that we didn't have a policy. We didn't introduce a policy and say, this is what we're going to do. We just did it. They did it. And they did it for a year. Alongside doing some very good, great improvements in their vegetarian and non-ruminant meat offer. And then after a year, they published a policy. And at that point, people said, but we want to, we need to have meat. We need to have ruminant meat. Where's it? You're infringing, you're reducing our freedoms here. People said, well, you haven't had it for a year and no one noticed. It was such an elegant and clever thing to do, and now we don't have ruminant meat. There's no strong calls to bring it back. So that's an extreme version, and then the kind of other one, which is very interesting, which I've had a PhD student working on this, is just changing the relative availability around. So if you've got a catering outlet and it conventionally offers maybe 4 options, and there might be 1 vegetarian or vegan, a couple of meat, and a fish option, for example, just changing the relative availability of those things. And what the student did massive experiments on outlets in Cambridge, about 250,000 meal choices in all in these different experiments to see how robust these effects were. Very convincing effect, where if you double the relative availability of the vegetarian option, you get between a 40 and a 70% uplift in the sales of vegetarian or vegan options at the expense of meat-based options. The meat's still there, you can still buy it, it's just not as much variety, and instead you have more variety and higher quality of vegetarian and vegan. And the really interesting thing about it, two really interesting things about it, one was that the effect was greatest because we were able to track people because they all buy their meals on cards. The effect was greatest on those who ate the most meat beforehand. So the impact was greatest on the most carnivorous, which are the people that we most need to move. So that was very reassuring. And the second was because we knew how many meals they buy every day, and we've known it for a year before the experiment, then through the course of the experiment, then afterwards. The experiment this intervention didn't shift people elsewhere. It wasn't just that the more vegetarian people stayed around and the meat eaters went and left and ate out at McDonald's that night. We know they didn't. Sales stayed up. In fact, profits went up because meat-based meals are more expensive to produce. That's what you can do in, I think, some of the things you can do in restaurants and those kind of outlets. I think another set of conversations around what you can do in supermarkets.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, maybe if you don't mind if I bring in a slight comment on this one as well, actually. Everybody here probably doesn't know, but my original business, which I would have been doing until we came into COVID-19, was running sampling and word of mouth campaigns through hairdressing salons. And I just wanted to say to everybody, if you want to get out messages to change behavior, face-to-face word of mouth is by far the best. So if your neighbor leans over and actually tells you that they've started to eat less meat, or that they're eating a fantastic plant-based substitute, you're quite likely to copy them. But how can you do that on the mass market? Well, pretty much the only way you can do it is go to the hairdressers. And I really am not joking. We've done it all over the world pre-COVID for many major products. And I dare to say for ones that produce awful carbon emissions, and we've now changed all that. But in fact, if you can go to all of your local hairdressers and you can present to them as a group directly and get them involved in all of your climate change policies, but particularly in something around dietary change or anything to do with health. If the hairdressers take it up, you will pump out hundreds of thousands of face-to-face discussions all the time. And through our network, we actually patented the idea of advertising on a mirror in a hairdressing salon to make it the only advert in the world where you couldn't turn your head to look away. So we stick the information on there. Have you heard about the latest diet? Have you heard about the latest product? Ask your hairdresser. She's been doing it. And just as an example, we did it with organic vegetarian stock cubes from Callow, and we had hairdressers talking about the recipes they cooked with it for hundreds of thousands of people. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but on the communication, I thought that was useful to bring it in. Okay, and back to our actual questions. I think let's talk hedgerows. So several people have mentioned hedgerows, and it's a very British topic to bring in. And people have talked about, shouldn't we be encouraging the growth of hedgerows? And would you know if this is would help to increase pasture yield, wildlife habitat, and carbon sequestration? Helen, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Just on the carbon sequestration point, it would help, but it's just really very inadequate in terms of the scale of the reductions that we need, or the removals that we need to be making. Just doing hedgerows is really not going to get us to that point. It does help to provide more habitat for birds, but again, it depends on how those hedgerows are actually maintained and what's, you know, if they're being sort of cut too early to disturb nesting, or if they are disturbed by other processes. So for example, if the farming practices are kind of in too close proximity, all of these factors really need to be considered. And again, yeah, while they would provide more habitat, it's still nowhere near enough to actually tackle the biodiversity crisis that we're in. So we need much more than hedgerows, basically.
I'd agree with that. Although I come from a part of the world where I mourn the loss of hedgerows living in the fens. Obviously, having hedgerows is better than not having hedgerows. But for a given investment in, if you like, compensating farmers to do something for the climate, we'll get much further for our buck if we persuade them to reinstate wetlands or woodlands. So for a given amount of money, that's much more cost effective. And a critically important one in some parts of the country is reducing farming or reducing dryland farming on peat. So huge source of emissions in this country. Still not really know quite how big, but a very large portion of our land-based emissions come from continuing to drain and farm peat. I can watch the organic material blow away here on a dry summer's day, and so redistributing a little bit where we do our farming is also going to be important. Hedgerows are very nice, but they're not enough. We need to do this really at scale. The models I didn't present lots of data I could have done. The models I was talking about that were suggesting that we needed to be tackling this from 3 different angles for the UK. Those models involve going from around 13% woodland and wetland in this country to around 30%. That's the scale. So more than well over doubling the extent. If we do that, we can just about get towards carbon neutrality for the food sector, not anything else. That's the scale of it. On the other hand, that just makes us look like Germany. It doesn't, this isn't turning us into some wilderness, but it's that much woodland and wetland.
Just in connection, we had a question about whether reforestation on floodplains should be being encouraged. Andrew, would you like to go first on this one?
Possibly. I think it depends if it's reforestation or not. So if the forests were, if it's reforestation, i.e. the trees were there in the first place, quite probably. If it's afforestation, it might not be such a good idea. I think one of the key things with the floodplain management, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but looking at what's been going on the last 20 years in the Netherlands, is retreating from floodplains as far as possible to allow what in the Netherlands they call room for the river, but basically space where particularly winter floods, can expand into, rather than them being entirely constrained within a narrow channel, which with big ever-increasing pulses of water trying to get out to the sea is a good recipe for urban flooding at some point along the river's length. So I've been to places in the Netherlands where they've removed infrastructure, they've even removed villages in order to take down the banks, the polders, the banks rather, and the dikes, and allow the river to flood out during the winter.
Helen, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that it's more about restoring the native vegetation in those floodplains rather than planting trees as such. So it really depends on what that baseline is. But I think it's also a broader kind of catchment issue. So we mentioned this briefly earlier about kind of restoring native vegetation cover in the uplands could really help to control flood management across the entire water catchment. So it's really not just about floodplains. We need to be looking at more of a catchment level, and even thinking about some kind of keystone species like beavers, who are really quite crucial in kind of shaping rivers and helping to control flooding as well. So it's not even just about vegetation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We did have a comment earlier on as well, which I think is worth bringing out, and then see if you'd like to comment on it. That it would be important for all councils to have food strategies within their climate crisis plans. Would either of you actually know of a council that's got a good food strategy within their climate crisis plans? No, Helen?
I think London are doing something, because they are mentioned in the Global Lead City Network. So all of that information I just read out about Oslo, apparently London are in that as well. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing there.
That's the City of London?
Yeah.
Okay. Isaac, I noticed, has usefully put a few links in, but yes, we were thinking that maybe that's a very good area for actually creating something. So a way to do food strategies for everybody. So, okay. An interesting question came in saying, should we be learning something from indigenous food systems, where indigenous peoples maintain locally a sustainable relationship with the environment, produce all their food from it without destroying it? Are there lessons to be learned there?
I think there are, but I think we shouldn't be misty-eyed about this. Indigenous food systems support people at very low population density, or lower population densities on the average than we're living at. You know, we're on a planet with 11 billion. We're going into a planet with 11 billion people by the end of this century, and we're not going to be able to support people in ways that may have been or might be sustainable over long periods at much lower population densities. So I think there will be things to be learned from those systems. There'll be forms of farming. There'll be varieties, and there'll be dietary lessons as well. So there's things to be learned, but I think we have to combine that with all sorts of other things. Would be, yeah, that's my that would be my view. But there are some wonderful things out there to try to learn from. One of my favorites is rice fish co-culture, which is one of the oldest rice cultivation methods in parts of China, where you grow carp in the rice beds, and the carp bump into the rice stems, dislodge the pests off the rice, eat the pests. That's what feeds the carp. You don't need to spray your rice. You get the fish directly fertilizing the rice, and you get to eat fish as well. That's extraordinary. And there's very good data, that's 6,000 years old, very good data that produces higher yields than either carp ponds by themselves or rice by itself. But I think we have to be smarter about this and combine it with insights from anywhere we can get them, including new technologies that scientists are developing at the moment.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, and just to add, how we produce food and the kind of option space around that. So if we think about a less kind of impactful way of producing food, which might incorporate indigenous methods, for example, but might require more land. The extent to which we can do that really depends on the extent to which we go down the plant-based diet spectrum, because we won't actually have that land available if we don't head down that spectrum. So that's just a point to make there in terms of whether we can incorporate these other farming methods really depends on what we do with diets overall.
Okay, thank you. Pollinators. We know that our pollinators are being decimated and have been over the past 50 years in this country. Talking about both the what you've both been proposing, including Andrew's idea that we have to intensify the agriculture in the right way. Are pollinators a vital part of that? And if they are, what should we be doing to help them get from one area that they need to pollinate to another one? Do we need bee corridors? And should there be council strategies to encourage them? Andrew first.
I'm not a bee expert, so David Goulson or others, I would bow to, there are other people who know more about this than I do. My understanding of the literature, though, is that most pollination, we have to be clear what we're doing this for. If we're doing it for retaining crop pollination, then most pollination in this country and indeed around the world is done by a relatively small number of species. We do know, or it is increasingly known, how to retain those in the landscape. And I think the interesting thing is then to persuade via various sort of things we've just been talking about, different types of incentives, farmers to do so because it boosts their, in a way, because it boosts their yields. So that's a kind of farming problem, if you like, important, but that's a different one from retaining insects as biodiversity as a whole. Most insects don't contribute to crop production beneficially or negatively. And we know that the interventions that you use to keep pollinators in agricultural landscapes for the first problem, those interventions don't help the great majority of other insects. You know, if you want to have crop pollination, you'll be talking about relatively small scale habitats around the edges of fields and so forth, which are great for crop pollinators. They're not good for pollinators as a whole. So that's a different kind of problem. And for that, you need to retain relatively large and dynamic landscapes outside of production altogether. That's what we know. And to do that, you need to make space for nature by making sure that the farming you do is efficient as possible. There's a separate question about bees using corridors through landscapes, and I don't know. And I'd bow to people like Dave to say how much do those really help, and how much do you need them outside of the farmed landscape to help insects disperse across the system.
Helen?
Yeah, again, this is definitely not my area of expertise. I think it really depends on the extent to which we can farm differently and include more space for pollinators and include space for a more diverse range of pollinators as well. And that takes us back to the extent to which we go down the plant-based diet spectrum.
Okay. Great. Okay. I'm just seeing now just some of the few comments now down at the bottom. I've gone through most of the ones that I trawled out as we were going. So we had a comment about the National Farmers Union's policy of carbon neutral by 2040, including very little tree planting. I think from what you've already said, though, the sooner we get to a net zero target, the better. I did actually want to ask Andrew a little bit more on intensive farming. Andrew, would you envisage that for intensive farming, we should be thinking of indoor? So creating vertical indoor farms in order to intensify the use of the land?
Probably not, except for very high value crops. It's not going to be economic, I don't think. You can get very high yields out of vertical farming, even of cereals, but it costs an awful lot of money. And it's probably, in most cases, going to, at least for the time being, going to be very energy intensive. So whether it is greenhouse gas saving is questionable, the data that I've seen. Indoor farming for animal production is another question. And here I think there are, there's potential trade-offs, but in terms of animal safety, some aspects of animal welfare in terms of things about disease risk, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, even antimicrobial use in some cases. Well-regulated indoor systems can be more efficient than we might think, and have lower footprints. That's on that. On the NFUs, going to briefly to the NFUs policy, my understanding of that is, well, they talk to. I'm not completely convinced by the numbers that are laid out in that those numbers actually add up to carbon neutrality by 2040 by any stretch. And I think it's to do with, you know, there are questions around the assumptions they make about longevity of methane production, methane retention in the atmosphere, and around the amount of carbon that's drawn down by pastures. So I'm not convinced that it would achieve carbon neutrality by 2040 by any means. And I think there are other things we could do that would do so much faster and more robustly.
Helen, do you want to comment?
No, just I completely agree with that.
Okay, I think we're now drawing ourselves near to the end. Helen, I believe you have a couple of other slides you'd like to show in a summary, is that right?
Not necessarily a summary, but they are, well, I can share them anyway.
Maybe just while you're finding it, because a couple of people put in from my story about hairdressers, about cab drivers being good for spreading the word. There is a slight difference, and there was a survey done by Procter & Gamble, probably roughly 5, 6, 7 years ago, on who's the most influential in your life. And it's always your relatives and your nearest friends. But then hairdressers came way out in front of every single other group. They were the only one that really figured in being truly influential. And it probably stands to reason that in comparison to a cab driver that you may hail or ring and get a lift home in, your hairdresser's holding scissors to your ear on a regular basis every month, potentially for years and years and years, and is actually responsible for your outward appearance and your beauty, which we equate in some senses with our ease of going through life and our success. So they have a huge, huge influence. And there are that many stories about hairdressers who found out secrets that they shouldn't have done. I mean, even in my business, I have sat in a hairdressing salon when I've been visiting it on business, and a lady has been in there having her hair cut, and the hairdresser started dealing with her hair and said, oh, and how was your wonderful holiday in Menorca? And the lady said, oh, I haven't been to Menorca. And she said, oh, your husband was in last month and told me he'd just been to Menorca. So, and these sort of things are talked about in hairdressers and probably wouldn't be talked about so much in cab driver situations. So hairdressers are very, very, very useful if we can incorporate them. Anyway, that's an aside. Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. I haven't got hairdressers on here. That doesn't mean that I disagree with the point that you made. So I guess just to go back to what you were saying about having a full day to kind of map out a blueprint for local council. So these are some of the things that we could potentially cover during that day-long workshop. So we could look at different issues around food procurement, and I think one of the central things would be to actually set a target on food procurement. So for example, 50% by 2030 to align with the 2030 goal, and establishing the sort of basis for what the purchasing guidelines might be. There's a lot of things around food service that we could look at and provide more details, bring in more evidence around these things to really help shape the blueprints and what might work in different locations, for example. So there's a whole range of things here that I won't go into in detail, just to give an idea of the sort of things that might be relevant for councils and that we could consider on that day-long workshop. And we also have a whole range of things around food environments, which could include fresh food markets, for example, if we think about access to food being a really important part of people's choices going forward, going back to the stuff that Andrew was talking about from his research, where availability was really quite a key aspect in terms of what people choose to eat. So if we make food more available throughout the city, that could take us a good way towards encouraging people along those dietary change. So we have education as well, which I think is a really interesting one, really important, and might not be seen as kind of directly relevant to a food strategy in terms of helping to achieve reductions through a certain measure like food procurement. But I think it could be really important to have that in there as well. And there's various ways that could happen. And then we've talked about land use in terms of use quite a bit already. So those were just some ideas. It would be brilliant to hear back from people in terms of what kind of things they would find useful to be covered in the day-long workshop and what sort of evidence we could bring in to help shape those. And I will. You're on mute, Ed.
Yes, keep clicking it. It wasn't coming off. Okay, thank you, Helen. And everybody, that's planned for the 23rd of April. So the plan is to have a session lasting most of the day, creating food strategies. That's when it's planned. We will fix it when we find out the interest from everybody. And that's actually the day after Mother Earth Day. And we will probably plan a Scientists Warning Europe to also run a session on nature on Mother Earth Day. So please watch out for emails coming from us after this event. So all that remains then is to say thank you very, very much to Helen and Andrew, and to Marco, who's not here, but thank you so much for giving us these talks. Thank you everybody for attending, and I wish you all luck in implementing a lot of this advice in council plans going on in the future. Please do let us know how you get on and send any questions through to Scientists Warning Europe. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Bye.